The moment Harrison Quint snapped his fingers at the driver in the lobby of the Fairmont Pacific Rim, the sound carried across the marble floor like a single struck note. Cold and deliberate. He had already made the man carry 3 bags that were not his, corrected his pronunciation twice without being asked, and told the young woman at the concierge desk that the service at this particular hotel had declined since his last visit, though the woman's face suggested she had no memory of him visiting at all. But it was the next sentence, delivered loudly enough that the 4 associates trailing behind Quint stopped walking, that marked the moment everything began to unravel. "The man who drives the car," Harrison Quint said, not bothering to lower his voice, "doesn't get to have an opinion about the destination." Gideon Rourke did not look away. He set the last bag down on the trolley with the same unhurried care he had used loading it outside, straightened slightly, and asked in a voice that carried no heat whatsoever whether Mr. Quint still intended to proceed with the assessment review the following morning. Quint laughed. His associates laughed too, though at least one of them laughed a half-second late, the way people do when they are not entirely sure what they are laughing at. The driver, this quietly dressed man in his mid-40s who had said fewer than 20 words during the 2-hour drive from YVR, seemed to Quint like the last person capable of posing a meaningful question. He assumed it was bluster, an attempt at dignity from someone with no real ground to stand on. He stopped laughing when his own general counsel walked through the hotel entrance and went entirely still at the sight of the man standing beside the luggage trolley. Gideon Rourke spent the hour before every shift the same way he had spent most evenings for the past 4 years. At the kitchen island, heating something from a container while his 17-year-old son, Joel, sat at the table behind him doing something on his laptop that was either homework or not homework. And Gideon had long ago decided that asking only produced creative answers. Joel had his mother's instinct for reading a room. He looked up from the screen that evening and asked, almost without inflection, whether his father was going to let the Quint Capital deal close before the snow season, or whether he was going to stall until spring the way he had stalled with the last one. Gideon told him he hadn't decided yet, which was true, and that the weather had nothing to do with it, which was less true. Joel looked at him the way teenagers look at adults, who say things they believe are true but aren't, and returned to his screen without pressing the point. It was one of the qualities Gideon had come to depend on most since Faye died, his son's particular talent for knowing when to leave a silence alone. Faye Rourke had been gone 4 years and 3 months. She had died the week their firm was awarded the Provincial Environmental Assessment contract for the Northern CC Corridor, which meant that the thing Gideon was most proud of, professionally, would forever be attached, in the calendar of his memory, to the worst week of his life. He had taken the contract because she had pushed him to bid on it. She had believed in the technical side of what they were building long before any provincial authority had, and so he kept the contract partly out of professional judgment, and partly because letting it lapse would have felt like another kind of loss he could not afford. After Faye, Gideon had reduced his hours at Rourke Environmental Consulting to something manageable. He brought in a partner, Bridget Oakes, a hydrology specialist who had worked alongside them for 6 years and was more than capable of running the day-to-day operations. And he began driving 3, sometimes 4 evenings a week for a premium car service called Meridian Transport. Not because the money was strictly necessary, though it helped, but because driving required nothing of him except presence and attention, and in the years right after Faye's death, presence and attention were the only 2 things he could reliably offer. The work at Meridian had its own quiet structure. He picked up executives, lawyers, developers, visiting dignitaries. He listened when they needed to talk, stayed silent when they did not, and learned more about the private thinking of Vancouver's business community than he would have absorbed in a decade of attending formal meetings. People spoke freely in the back of a car, the way they never did in boardrooms, seeming to forget, with remarkable consistency, that the driver could hear them. It was through Meridian that Gideon had first encountered Harrison Quint 3 days earlier, when Quint had booked the service for his entire visit. Quint Capital was one of 3 Alberta-based energy development firms, competing for a partnership arrangement with Cascadia Infrastructure Partners, a Crown-adjacent development authority responsible for a northern mineral access corridor that happened to run directly through territory subject to Rourke Environmental Consulting's assessment license. The license was not incidental. It was the only legally recognized environmental clearance document in existence for that specific corridor, and without it, no construction permit could be issued by the provincial government. Gideon had spent 7 years building the data architecture behind it. It was, in every sense that mattered, the foundation on which the entire project rested. He had said nothing of this to Quint on the first drive, nor on the second. His reason was simple. The formal partnership discussion was still 3 days away, and Gideon had wanted to observe the man who might soon hold his life's work in his hands before that man ever learned his name. What he observed over those first 2 drives had given him reason for very careful thought. Harrison Quint arrived in Vancouver the way he arrived everywhere, with the assumption that the city had been waiting for him and that any friction it offered was a personal failing on the city's part rather than a natural consequence of existing outside his particular sphere. He was 51, expensively groomed, and possessed of the specific confidence that comes from decades of being the most powerful person in whatever room you enter. His associates, a COO named Stafford Healy, and 2 junior analysts who seemed to exist primarily to confirm his opinions, formed a small orbit that rotated around Quint's preferences with practiced efficiency. On the first drive from the airport, Quint had taken a phone call he made no attempt to lower his voice for, during which he told the person on the other end that the environmental assessment process in British Columbia was a provincial theater production, and that the sooner they could route around it, the better for everyone's timeline. Gideon noted this without reacting. On the second drive through downtown to a dinner meeting, Quint had overridden Gideon's suggested route even though the alternate added 11 minutes, and when traffic proved Gideon right, Quint did not acknowledge it. Also noted. On the third pickup, the long drive in from YVR with 4 associates and their luggage, Quint started in on Gideon's driving approximately 40 minutes out. He commented on his speed, then on his lane selection, then on whether Meridian required any formal training or simply hired whoever applied. Stafford Healy added a remark about the vehicle's interior temperature that nobody had asked for. When Gideon offered a brief observation about a detour due to an overpass closure, Quint interrupted to say the detour was unnecessary, and that he would personally contact Meridian's management about their navigational judgment. None of this disturbed Gideon in any meaningful way. He had driven enough difficult passengers to understand that people who need to dominate small interactions usually do so because something larger in their lives feels unmanageable, and he had stopped taking it personally somewhere in his 2nd year of driving. What stayed with him was not Quint's behavior in the car. It was the phone call near the end of the drive, when Quint apparently forgot, as he so often did, that the man in the front seat could hear everything. Quint was speaking with someone he called the legal contact in Ottawa. The substance was brief but clarifying. The environmental assessment, he told this contact, was not a document they intended to honor in any operational sense. They had a preferred approach involving a reclassification of certain corridor segments as low sensitivity zones, a classification that would not survive independent scrutiny, but that could, with the right internal documentation, hold long enough to get construction started before any regulatory challenge could be organized. Gideon kept his eyes on the road. His expression did not change. He filed the information away, the way he had filed everything else he had observed over 3 days of driving Harrison Quint around his city. At the Fairmont Pacific Rim, Quint watched Gideon unload the luggage with the studied boredom of someone who had decided that watching was itself a form of commentary. In the lobby, he walked 3 steps ahead and spoke to the concierge, without acknowledging that Gideon had followed with the bags. When a bellhop reached for the trolley, Quint waved him off and pointed at Gideon instead, as though the distinction were obvious. Then came the remark that changed everything. Gideon made a passing observation, quiet, professional, directly relevant, that the building permit timeline Quint's team had discussed in the car assumed a Phase 1 clearance that the current assessment structure could not support. It was technically precise. It was also exactly correct. Stafford Healy frowned. One of the analysts looked at his phone. Quint turned slowly, looked at Gideon as though seeing him fully for the first time, and delivered the line to his associates with something approaching theatrical precision. The man who drives the car doesn't get to have an opinion about the destination. He said it pleasantly. That was the detail that settled into the room like cold air from an opened window. Gideon held his gaze and asked, with the same steady evenness he used for everything, whether Mr. Quint still intended to attend the assessment review the following morning. Quint smiled the way people smile when they have already decided someone is irrelevant. He turned back toward the concierge desk. He did not answer because he saw no reason to. He did not see Niall Ferris walk through the lobby entrance at that moment. Niall was Gideon's legal counsel, a property and environmental contracts specialist who had managed the Rourke account for 9 years and who had come to the hotel simply to leave a document package at the concierge desk for the morning's meeting. Niall stopped walking the instant he saw Gideon's standing beside the luggage trolley. His expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and something very close to alarm in approximately 3 seconds. Quint's own general counsel, Leonie Garth, who had arrived seconds behind Niall and was already reading her phone when she walked through the doors, looked up and saw the same man. She knew Gideon Rourke not from photographs, but from the briefing materials she had compiled on his firm in preparation for the partnership negotiation. Materials that included, among other things, a professional biography and a formal headshot, which matched the man standing beside the luggage trolley in every particular. Leonie closed her phone. She looked at Quint. She looked at Gideon. She did not speak for a moment, which was unusual for her, and the unusual silence was enough to make Quint turn back around. It was Neil who spoke first. He addressed himself to Quint's associates rather than to Quint, which was a choice with its own meaning. I believe Mr. Quint has had some time with Gideon Rourke this evening. He let that settle. Gideon Rourke is the founding partner of Rourke Environmental Consulting. His firm holds the provincial assessment license for the Northern BC corridor. The license your entire partnership structure legally requires before a single permit can be issued. No one moved. Stafford Healy appeared to be doing arithmetic in his head. Quint's expression recalibrated smoothly and without visible shame, shifting from dismissal into the practiced warmth that had probably closed 100 deals in 100 boardrooms. "Well," he said, "that's a hell of an introduction." Gideon did not return the warmth. He'd told Quint, without raising his voice, that he had been driving for Meridian on and off for 4 years, well before the corridor license was worth anything to anyone in Alberta. He said he had not engineered the encounter as a test, but that what he had heard in the car over 3 days and what had just happened in a hotel lobby in front of 6 people had given him a great deal to consider before morning. He removed his Meridian lanyard, set it on the trolley handle, and walked out through the same doors he had carried Quint's luggage through 10 minutes earlier. By the following morning, Quint had called for a meeting 3 times, sent messages through Stafford Healy twice, and had Leonie place a formal call to Niall's firm offering a $20 million premium to the original structure if Gideon would confirm by 9 a.m. that the corridor agreement was still on the table. Gideon read the messages from his kitchen. Joel had already left for school. The coffee was still warm, and the apartment was quiet in the particular way it got on weekday mornings, a silence that belonged to the city rather than to any sadness. He thought about what Quint had said on the phone in the car. He thought about the phrase route around it. He thought about the corridor, which ran through territory where 3 First Nations communities had been navigating resource disputes for most of a decade, and had finally arrived at a protection framework that his assessment license was one of the few instruments actually enforcing. He thought about Faye and about the years she had spent pushing him to build something precise and useful, rather than merely profitable. He called Neil. He told him to send the formal notice. Rourke Environmental Consulting was withdrawing from all partnership discussions with Quint Capital. The arrangement, which represented the largest infrastructure licensing deal in the firm's history, collapsed before a signature had been placed on any final page. Quint's response was swift and organized. His communications team released a statement within hours describing Gideon as a contractor who had abruptly withdrawn from negotiations to pursue a competing offer, implying that Rourke Environmental was a boutique firm whose assessment license had been overstated in strategic importance. Several energy sector publications ran the story before noon, most of them noting, with a particular emphasis they returned to more than once, that Gideon also drove for a car service. Quint reached out directly to 2 junior firms that had partnered with Rourke Environmental on subcomponents of the assessment, warning them that continued association with Gideon's company made them a liability in future Quint Capital projects. One ended its arrangement within 48 hours. The other held on, but the call had been enough to unsettle their confidence. Bridget Oakes, who had been managing 3 active files and a pending contract renewal when everything broke, now faced the possibility that the corridor work, nearly a third of the firm's active revenue, would be tied up in uncertainty long enough to destabilize the contracts below it. She did not ask Gideon to reconsider. She asked him, plainly and without drama, whether he had understood the full cost before deciding. It was the right question, and he told her he was still measuring it. Joel noticed the change in his father the way he noticed most things without announcing it. He found Gideon at the kitchen table at 11:30 on a Wednesday, reading something printed on paper, and instead of asking what it was, made tea and sat across from him and waited. That kind of patience in a 17-year-old is either a natural gift or something carefully learned. In Joel's case, it was both. It was Leonie Garth who reached out to Niall 9 days later, not through official channels, not during business hours. She called from a personal number and chose her words with care. She told him that Quint was not simply applying pressure. He had retained a former subcontractor who had worked briefly with Rourke Environmental 2 years earlier on a data modeling component of the assessment. This subcontractor did not have the full assessment architecture, but he understood enough of the methodology to help Quint Capital's internal team produce a parallel document, something close enough to the original to present to the province as independently developed, while simultaneously filing a challenge against Rourke's license on grounds of conflict of interest. The challenge would not ultimately succeed, but it would take 18 months to resolve, and 18 months of contested licensure would effectively freeze every permit process in the corridor. By the time any legal decision was handed down, Quint intended to have a different arrangement in place entirely. Leonie was not willing to give a formal statement. She said she had a career, and she knew what formal statements cost. But she told Niall enough that he knew exactly where to look. Gideon's technical team found the irregularities in the server access logs within 4 days. A third-party account linked to a consulting firm that had billed Quint Capital on 2 previous projects had extracted methodology documents from a shared archive that was designated read-only. No raw data had been taken, but the structural framework. The part that was genuinely novel, the part Gideon and Faye had developed together in the firm's early years, was now in someone else's possession. The subcontractor, when interviewed, said he had not fully understood who was funding the arrangement. He had been told it was a provincial government advisory project. He cooperated once he understood what he had actually been part of. Buried inside Quint Capital's hastily assembled competing document, Gideon's team found something left there by accident. A formatting string embedded in the metadata, invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it, that Gideon had inserted into every Rourke environmental document for years as an internal version marker. Its presence meant the document had been constructed from material that originated inside Rourke's own systems. What they still needed was proof that Quint had personally directed the use of the extracted material, rather than simply allowing Stafford Healy to act on his own initiative. They did not have to wait long. Quint requested a meeting at the same Fairmont Hotel, at the same hour of the evening, a choice of setting so deliberate that it ceased to be subtle. He offered to purchase Rourke Environmental Consulting outright for a figure significantly below its assessed value, warned Gideon that refusing would mean a prolonged license dispute, continued industry pressure, and a lasting narrative about a part-time driver who had fundamentally misunderstood the importance of his own position in things. Niall had advised Gideon to record the conversation, which was legal in British Columbia with single-party consent. Quint was careful. He spoke in implications rather than declarations. He did not say the words that would close a courtroom door permanently behind him, but the implication was coherent enough. When Stafford Healy approached Gideon privately outside the hotel afterward, claiming disillusionment with Quint and offering internal communications in exchange for money and guaranteed immunity, Gideon recognized the shape of the trap and declined to engage with anything outside of legal representation. 2 days later, Quint's communications team released a selectively edited clip from the hotel's exterior surveillance footage, framed to suggest that Gideon had initiated the private meeting with Stafford Healy and had offered payment in exchange for documentation that would discredit his employer. Leonie Garth watched the clip from her office and spent an evening deciding what she was actually willing to do. She sent Niall a file. Inside, it was an audio recording from an internal Quint Capital strategy session, captured on a device she had left running in the boardroom after being asked to step out. The recording was clean, the voice was unmistakable. Use the license challenge to drain them. A firm that size cannot sustain 18 months of suspended work. By the time they fold, we won't need to buy anything at all. The provincial authority convened an emergency licensing review at the request of 3 First Nations consultation bodies, who had been monitoring the corridor dispute and submitted a joint intervention. Gideon and Niall presented the evidence in sequence. The methodology theft, the forged provenance on Quint's competing document, the metadata marker, the recording, and a full account of the pressure campaign against Rourke's partner firms. Leonie submitted a written statement, which she had ultimately decided to provide after her own legal counsel reviewed the situation and told her plainly that the existing evidence would implicate her in any cover-up, whether she volunteered or not. Quint attended the review flanked by 2 lawyers, and the confidence of a man who had not yet understood how completely the ground had shifted beneath him. When he saw Gideon seated at the opposite table, he made a remark to one of his counsel, audible, intended to be audible, that this was a regulatory proceeding, not an occasion to summon a driver. Gideon looked at him with the same expression he had used in the hotel lobby, at the luggage trolley, and at every point between. Calm, direct, unbothered, he said, quietly enough that it required some effort to hear across the table. that this time it was Quint who was waiting on someone else's decision. The panel asked questions for 2.5 hours. Quint's legal team objected and requested delays, and argued that the recordings had been obtained through methods that compromised their validity, a position the panel noted and set aside. Stafford Healy, facing his own exposure, submitted a supplementary statement confirming that the directive to retain the subcontractor and use the extracted material had come directly from Quint in a closed executive meeting. The panel did not deliberate for long. Quint Capital's competing assessment document was disqualified. The challenge against Rourke's license was dismissed. Quint was referred to the Provincial Securities Authority for investigation into disclosure irregularities filed during the initial partnership process. He was removed as CEO of Quint Capital by his own board within 2 weeks, after a shareholder request triggered a governance review that the board's legal team advised could not responsibly be deferred. He forfeited his performance shares, lost the advisory committee positions he had held for 7 years, and was formally barred from representing Quint Capital in any negotiations going forward. Stafford Healy's termination followed shortly after. Leonie Garth was appointed interim general counsel with a mandate to reconstruct every contract the company had filed in the past 3 years. The morning after the provincial ruling, Gideon received a call from a consortium of northern development companies, including 2 jointly controlled by First Nations investment arms, who had been observing the corridor dispute for 2 years and had finally reached the position to bring a fully structured proposal forward. The partnership they offered was worth $135 million over 8 years, with terms that included firm protections against assessment override, a formal community review process built into every phase of deployment, profit-sharing provisions for the 3 affected nations, and an equity position for Bridget Oakes and the senior technical staff at Rourke Environmental. Gideon called Bridget before he called anyone else. She listened to the terms without interrupting, then asked which provision he was most likely to want adjusted before signing. He told her probably none of them, which was the most settled he had sounded in weeks, and she laughed in a way that told him she had been waiting for exactly that answer. Joel heard about it from a friend who had seen something online, and came home that afternoon with the casual air of someone pretending not to have been tracking the situation all week. He sat at the table where he always did his homework and asked his father, without looking up from his screen, whether the deal was actually done. Gideon told him it was signed. Joel nodded slowly. He asked, after a moment, whether his father was going to keep driving for Meridian. Gideon thought about it honestly. He said he thought he might, once or twice a month, when the schedule allowed. Joel looked up then, fully, with the expression he had inherited from his mother. The one that saw through whatever framing someone had placed around a thing and went straight to what it actually was. "Because you want to," Joel said, "not because of anything else." Gideon said yes, exactly because of that. 3 months later, Quint Capital issued a public statement under the direction of its incoming CEO, apologizing to Rourke Environmental Consulting, to the 3 First Nations consultation bodies, and to every firm that had been pressured during the campaign. The statement was careful and formal, and stopped well short of the full admission the situation might have warranted. But it existed, which was more than Gideon had expected. The shareholder litigation against Quint personally was ongoing and expected to take years. There was no single dramatic courtroom moment, no clean collapse a camera could hold. Just the slow, expensive, public process of a man discovering that the power he had always treated as a personal attribute had in fact belonged to his position, and that positions, unlike attributes, can be taken away. Bridget hosted a small dinner at her home in East Vancouver to mark the signing of the consortium agreement. Gideon brought Joel, who spent most of the evening talking to Bridget's youngest about audio software and ate more at a social occasion than Gideon had seen him eat in 2 years, which counted as a meaningful sign. Near the end of the night, when most of the guests had moved to the back deck, and the conversation had loosened into the kind of talk that happens after a genuinely difficult stretch of months is finally over, Bridget came and stood beside Gideon in the kitchen while he refilled his coffee. She told him she had been worried, in the middle of all of it, that he was going to give in. Not because she thought he was weak, but because she understood how much of what he was protecting was actually about Faye. The work Faye had believed in, the framework Faye had pushed him to build, and she knew that sometimes the things we protect for someone we have lost can begin to feel like they belong to the past rather than to anything still living. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He said she wasn't wrong about that. He said it had taken him a while to understand that protecting the work wasn't the same as holding on to what was gone. Somewhere in the middle of everything, he had realized that what he was really fighting for was not the past at all. It was the people the license existed to protect, people who had no idea his name existed and had never asked him to do a single thing on their behalf. And once he understood that clearly, the rest had become simple. He drove for Meridian again the following Friday. His first pickup was a development consultant from Montreal who fell asleep 20 minutes outside the airport and snored quietly the rest of the way in. The city moved past the windows in the way it did on a clear October night in Vancouver. The mountains dark against a sky still holding a trace of blue above the western water. The streets wet from an earlier rain that had already passed. Gideon drove without thinking about deals or documents or the long months of pressure that were finally behind him. He drove the way he had always driven when the work was good, steadily, without hurry, attentive to the road and nothing else. It was quiet work, and it asked nothing of him, except that he show up and do it well. He had never once believed there was anything wrong with that, and driving through a city he had lived in for 20 years, on a calm October night, he found he still didn't.